So, did anybody watch The Lord of the Rings or read the book? Yeah, so do you remember the important distinction about a steward? He's not a king, right? That's why I describe myself as the chief steward, the steward of your special place. I'm not a king. There's a lot of superintendents that think they are the king. I recognize that I am your steward. I am operating on your behalf, and it's great to be here today. Thank you for coming. A gorgeous day today. Like today, you make me feel like sort of important. I couldn't resist the temptation, of course, to be able to speak in the Murray Auditorium. I mean, really, like this is perfect. Before we get started, I wanted to do something, and that's to call Michelle up and give her a little gift on behalf of a grateful community. Michelle does all these wonderful things in the name of education, and UAF is one of the Denali's oldest and most long-standing education partners. And we have some other partners who work with us, and they gave me some gifts to give away. And so on behalf of our Denali Education Center, we wanted to give you one of these Pendleton blankets from Subaru that are to honor our awesome education partners. And, you know, on behalf of everybody here, I think a huge thank you for making these things possible.
You really are the best.
Surprise. So, and then I'd like to introduce you to my wife Gretchen and son Bobby. They're going to come down because I'll give you a little secret. During part of this session, I'll have pictures of random parks that appear. Put your hand up. The first one with their hand up, they'll shout at you. If you get the name of the park right, we have prizes for you. So hopefully that'll keep you on your toes. I don't know what you came in terms of what your expectations were. What I really hope to do today is just share some stories. That's sort of what we in Park Service do anyway, right? An interpretation. I want to share some stories, and I'm not going to give you much of a chance until the end to get in any of the really hard, controversial Denali stuff. We might introduce some of those topics along the way as sort of lessons I've learned on my road to Denali. But I'm not going to start right in with wolves and what's the battle with the board game shaping up like these days, or what about access and are there too many vehicles? If those are questions you guys have, save them till the end, and hopefully that's what we'll be queuing up. What I really hope to do is just start a conversation, and as you'll see by the end of this, start more of a relationship with folks, and particularly what I like to consider to be my neighbors up here in Fairbanks. I hope by the end you'll see that there's a common theme in terms of the lessons I've learned on my road, and that's that those relationships are really the most pivotal or important part of all of us protecting our special places. And so this is more about relationship building and storytelling than it is any sort of political sound bites or warfare. So how did my road begin? In many ways, I'd say my road began as a tale of two grandfathers, right? So, by the way, are there any English teachers? Okay, good. I had to check myself because I was redundant in the title of this, right? A former East Coast kid. Obviously, I'm not a kid anymore, so I tried to make up with a couple of my literary references, but I wasn't sure if anyone was going to fact-check me, right? So, Tale of Two Cities, right? Tale of Two Grandfathers, 1914 to 1918. It was the best of times in many ways. Anybody give me an example of why during those years? UAF people, 1917. Yes, exactly. And similarly, Mount McKinley National Park was established in 1917. It's also our 100th anniversary. It might be a prize. Who got that correct? Yeah, this gentleman. Newark, or Norfolk Naval Base, right? I just found today, 1917, 100th anniversary. Best of times, I would also say, because these two characters that you'll meet in a minute were in their adolescence. I think their adolescence was their formative years, and really shaped them, which in many ways shaped me. So I'll introduce you to these two characters in a second. I have to follow through with the illusion, right? There's really no transition to this slide, but if it's the best of times, it also had to sort of be the worst of times to keep the Tale of Two Cities reference going. So World War I, yeah? In many ways that shaped or the precursor of that shaped grandpa number one, Opa Schneider, Carl Schneider, and his journey here to the United States. You can see Opa there. He's that handsome fella. You can see the ship too, the USS Arunda, that he came over when he was 13 in about 1907 to avoid the buildup in Germany to what was World War I. And boy, the stories I could tell you about Opa Schneider, I should probably keep them relevant to this, but I have to tell you one or two stories that I learned about when he was later in life, in fact, 72. When Opa was young, he was a beer distributor, so his job was actually to go around to bars and try to get folks to like his brand of beer. Always has a great time talking. In his 70s, he went to one of his favorite hangouts in Buffalo, New York, and he had to go to the bathroom, and the bathroom was otherwise occupied. So he climbed up the stairs to the second story, went out on the deck, did his business, turned around to discover the door had locked behind him. So he jumped into a snowbank, went back into the bar, and continued entertaining his friends. 2 years later, he was sitting at a different bar in Buffalo, New York, and some bad guys came in masks. And this is, I don't know, 7:30 at night. It's the guys that are getting together to solve the world's problems that are all on their Social Security checks, right? So they have $5 each in their pocket or whatever. I don't know why they chose this particular bar. But as they went down the line with their guns, with their bags, give me your wallet, give me your watch, they got to Opa Schneider and he said, "I'll be damned if I'm giving you my wallet." And they let him go. Collected everybody else's. So he took his $5 and said, "Beer for everybody." Right? Good that he was able to save his $5. I guess that gives you a little bit of sort of the kind of person that he was. Really an easygoing guy, right? Easy rapport with people, good-natured, gets along with everybody. Of course, he came over, so he's an immigrant himself. And as an immigrant, cue for a potential prize, he probably came through... Nice. There you go. Ellis Island. That's perfect. So Opa, and here's a picture of him in 1983 on the right with my father, Fran Stryker Jr. on the left. Opa loved adventure, and he was a wanderer. He lived in Buffalo, New York. By then, I was outside of Philadelphia. I grew up mostly outside of Philadelphia, born in West Point, New York, right? My father was in the military. But then we followed his job down to the Philadelphia area. Opa would have a habit of wandering, and he would just show up at our doorstep. I mean, this is hundreds of miles away, and he would go out to the store for a loaf of bread and continue to Philadelphia and say, "Here I am. Donnie, let's go." And he would grab me, and we would go somewhere and explore constantly, whether it was the fields initially when I was, 7, behind the apartment complex that we lived. Sometimes these journeys would end in a bar, and my parents would have to come find us, right? And we'd be propped up, my sister and I. And Dad got a little mad about that. But many times it was just a nature walk, and it was just to explore new country, and he was always super curious about the history and the flora and the fauna and questioning everything and leading by example, sort of showing me the value of all those special places. So as I was older, I'd say maybe 10, he dragged me to places that were a little farther away in Philadelphia to explore them. Any guesses? Valley Forge, good answer. So that's George Washington's headquarters building. And we would wander all around the fields of Valley Forge all day long. Sometimes if he could find wild onions or berries, he would be picking them and feeding them to me. Other than that, it was just constant exploration, constant go, go, go. And I quickly became his sort of go-to grandchild because I was always up for these journeys, right? They were always fun and had some element of adventure. Another favorite spot for him in the area that we lived in, of course, would be Gettysburg. Awesome, yeah, Gettysburg. So lots of fields, lots of places to walk, lots of deep history to explore. And I think that set me up in many ways for sort of my natural curiosity now. The other grandfather you actually may have heard of, at least those of you who are my age or older, Francis Hamilton Stryker. So he's the author of The Lone Ranger, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, The Green Hornet, Tom Quest. You probably didn't hear of Tom Quest, but you might have heard of Johnny Quest, which was a sort of a rip-off cartoon of this Tom Quest series. Anyway, so he wrote all these, he created these characters and wrote radio scripts and later books. Sold the copyrights, by the way, during the Depression for $10, thus keeping me from being fabulously wealthy, right? So here I am today. I like to say that literally because here I am today. I can't imagine that I, at 14 and super rich, would last very long. So it was probably a blessing that we weren't fabulously wealthy. But he wrote all these scripts, and there's a funny story about him, actually, if you just look at this picture, right? Does it look like he can type? Because he couldn't, right? Totally staged. He wrote the equivalent of about a Gone with the Wind every 4 months in scripts as a two-finger typer, right? Very early in the early days of radio didn't last that long when you think about it. It was only about a 15-year heyday before it was starting to get replaced by the television. But in its heyday, you had to be super creative. So he was literally working on science stories and cowboy stories and college days and multiple scripts. In some cases, as they were being broadcast live, he was hammering out the script and handing the sheets back to the actors behind him. Unbelievably prolific as a writer. But also obviously a great teller of stories. And if you can think about the importance of radio was you had to do all these things that you don't have to do with TV, right, in order to really grab onto your audience. So think about the Great White Horse Silver and the silver bullets, right? There's all these things to really get your imagination going and paint the picture in a way that really, I think, is much more impressive than just today using sci-fi special effects or whatever. So there he is. So he's my paternal grandfather. So Opa Schneider's my maternal grandfather, and Fran Stryker is my paternal grandfather. And I'm willing to take him on. Whoever wants to sue me, saying that somebody else created the Lone Ranger. This has been a bit of a debate over the years. You can ask about it later if you have Ranger trivia. But I actually have the paper from the guy that bought the top copyrights that says, "Thank you for your creation. Of course, you can feel free to share this." And in the past, when that outfit's threatened to sue, we pull that piece of paper out when he was on To Tell the Truth, if you remember that show, for example, and they sort of quickly back off. But there's a certain amount of revisionist history if you look at Wikipedia. They're giving credit to two guys now, and I never met him. He died before I was born, but when pressed during his day on the answer to the question, so who actually created the Lone Ranger, his answer was only God creates, right? So it just wasn't a big deal to him, and clearly it was a collaborative process back then. So it's not really going into the details of that. But unbelievable words per minute, unbelievable grasp of sort of random trivia. And of course, think about the books that he wrote and the impressions he would have had on a young man like me, right? I want horses and guns, in the case of the Lone Ranger, right? I had to have a dog that was a shepherd, like Sergeant Preston's dog. You get to the Green Hornet, and of course I had to take karate, right? Like Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was a huge role model for me in my early years. And the other thing I think in terms of values when you think about A Tale of Two Grandfathers, oh, by the way, that's about as far west as he ever got. And the name of it, yeah, it is St. Louis. The Arch. You can hit any of them. The proper term is Jefferson Expansion National Memorial, if you want to get technical or split hairs, right? That it sort of commemorates that silly purchase that Jefferson had of, right, the Louisiana Purchase. So interesting place. But he wrote all these stories of the West with wide open places and really cool adventures, having never been west or farther west than Detroit or St. Louis. He had a creed, and I'll just put that creed up there for you for a second, because I think that there are elements of that. Now, that's one of the things I think when you looked at the character of the ranger, and there have been authors who have written on this topic, he didn't really have special powers. He was easy to identify with. And some professors who teach ethics have postulated that in many ways that Lone Ranger character was perhaps the most pivotal piece of shaping what we call America's greatest generation, right? Our greatest generation. They were in that generation that was listening to the radio and using their imagination. And he didn't have any super skills, he had just normal skills. But he followed sort of this creed. And this was, if you wanted to join the Lone Ranger fan club, this is what you had to sign off on. And in many ways, that's sort of a foundational set of building blocks that I like to think was very formative in my years in terms of my personal values of integrity and honesty and accountability and transparency and fairness and inclusiveness. I say inclusiveness, right? Some of my Indian friends throughout my career have given me grief about the whole Tonto thing, which, by the way, Bill Cosby started, okay? So if you want to talk about racism, Bill, bring it on. I get a little defensive because in his day, if you think about the 1930s, that was the period of forced assimilation of Indian children. We would take Indian children out of their homes. And the Lone Ranger character, although they still had the guttural, ugh, whatever, which is a legitimate criticism. I think it's a legitimate present-day criticism. But in that time period, the trusty sidekick, Kimosabe, trusty scout, for his equal, the guy that rescues him, to be an American Indian was incredible. And the way to sort of instill that spirit of inclusiveness was very subversive, I guess, maybe, Machiavellian from a marketing perspective. But you fast forward to the time that the Green Hornet came around, and all of a sudden it's World War II, and now the trusty sidekick is a Japanese American, right? So in many ways, I grew up learning about this importance of inclusiveness, and you could see some of that built into not the code of conduct per se, but he also had sort of rules for the road for writing the radio scripts. The Lone Ranger is never captured or held for any length of time by lawmen, because that way he won't be unmasked. You won't find out who he is. When he has to use guns, he never shoots to kill, right? The Lone Ranger never wins against hopeless odds, right? Because you don't want to build up this expectation that he could fly or do something. It's always very achievable or attainable for the young people in the audience. Even though the Lone Ranger offers his aids to individuals or small groups, the ultimate objective of his story is to imply that their benefit is only a byproduct of a greater achievement, that achievement being the development of the West or the development of our country and our style of democracy, right? And the importance of protecting our democracy. Names of unsympathetic characters are carefully chosen. Importantly, you never choose an adversary who's from a minority group. All the adversaries will always be American, so that you're not feeding the fire of any of that sort of discrimination. So, both people sort of like to wander, both are curious, both have this passion for the West, and like to tell stories. You would have thought it was a natural for me to think of a career in the National Park Service, but it actually took a while for me to get there. I'll show you this house because it's relevant to the only God creates and did he really do it? So there's a guy named Zane Grey. Anybody heard of him? Yeah, so 1907 or 08, he writes a book called The Lone Star Ranger. I mean, come on, man. This is Zane Grey's house at the Upper Delaware National Scenic River. That's random. I mean, if anybody would have gotten that, I would have been really impressed, but I thought I'd throw that picture in there. So, we started our careers, Gretchen and I, in Washington, D.C., right? This was sort of random. If you think that there's a purpose or a path that I charted to get to Denali as the chief steward of the park, forget about it. This was completely random. I'm in a little or actually a very big high school, but I don't necessarily have any particular direction. Randomly, I start dating a girl who ended up being awesome, amazing for me, but I'm super competitive. And she was really into getting good grades. So by 10th grade, I'm competing to get really good grades. I don't know anything about colleges. I'm just competing because I like to win, right? So I end up basically getting straight A's just because I'm competing. And her goal was to go to one of these things called Ivy League schools, right? I don't know what Ivy League is, but I'm going to go there. If that's the hardest to get into, I'm going to go to one of those. That's how I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, literally. Not because I thought Pennsylvania was going to be a great school, right? I wish perhaps it were different, that I sort of had this path and I could tell you that I charted things, but I didn't. I went to Penn sort of with this impression that since it was Ivy League, we were going to sit around in the grass, right? And we were going to read John Locke, and then we were going to compare notes on what we thought about it. I got there, and within my first month and a half, I was sorely disillusioned. And what I learned is we don't sit in the grass, we sit in big classrooms, and we read John Locke, but we don't compare notes about what we think. We regurgitate the professor's interpretation of John Locke. And so I was ready to be out. And so I wanted to transfer, well, actually that's funny. That was piece one. I'm disillusioned with the college at the University of Pennsylvania. The other thing I learned that I didn't know when I applied into the college was there was a positive Spanish requirement, a positive language requirement, right? That means I couldn't just hobble along like I did in high school and take the classes and get the grades. I had to actually speak it and write it before I could graduate. So I said, this is not so good. I need to get out of the college. And so I was choosing another school, and it was going to be between engineering or this business school, the school called the Wharton School of Business, which I didn't know anything about. And frankly, shouldn't it be easy to transfer into the business school? I mean, in high school, business was like typing, right? Which, talk about another lesson learned. That's something I should have taken, typing, right? But this Wharton School of Business, arrogant as they are, told me I needed to have a 3.9 at the end of my freshman year if I wanted to transfer into their college. And so that kind of made me angry, and I was pretty competitive, so I got a 3.95 and transferred into Wharton. Just because if it's that hard, there must be something special about it. So I ended up graduating from the Wharton School of Business without knowing that it was this big deal, that another Donald from Wharton, right? I know. I thought that was my ticket to Director of Park Service, actually, when he won the election, but nobody called me yet. So randomly, we end up in Washington, D.C. because I have a degree from Wharton, and what better to do than financial systems consulting? So I go to work for a big outfit in D.C. Well, it was that or Wall Street, right? In Wall Street, I went up to New York City, and forget about it. That was scary to me, even as a Philadelphia kid. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. I end up in Washington, D.C. doing consulting for the government. Nobody shouted out at this one yet. Iwo Jima, okay. I saw, put your hands up if you answered it correctly, and Bobby will grab you. So yeah, Iwo Jima. This is where we played Ultimate Frisbee, Gretchen and I. So this sort of became our outdoor experience, was these national monuments and national malls. And then on weekends and holidays, we're hiking the Appalachian Trail, right? That's pretty cool. But it was always calling to me, you know, this isn't great wide open spaces. You know, it's neat to get away on the weekend. And then after working for a couple of different clients, I ended up being a project manager who installed the National Park Service's accounting system. And that's when I had the epiphany, and I said, as I got to know this organization, I want to be a park manager when I grow up. How do I go about charting this path?
What year are you
In the Park Service?
You're talking.
Oh, so this is about 1989. 1989. I graduated in 87. By 2 years later, I was consulting for the Park Service, and that's when I started scheming and plotting to figure out how can I go to work for the Park Service. And I never sort of knew any of this other background that other park rangers will tell you, that you have to be a disadvantaged park ranger living in poverty for 40 years before you get your first permanent job. See, there's a little secret for good jobs. You could come in jobs that nobody else wants, like being an accountant in Washington, D.C., right? And you can come in at a relatively high level being an accountant in Washington, D.C., and sort of bypass a lot of the other trials and tribulations. So there's some interesting lessons learned there. You know, the other things that I learned while I was in D.C., frankly, were the bar in government is really low for customer service, right? Not shocking to anybody, but it's something that was very influential on my life and my career, because starting as a consultant, our money was tied to whether or not we did business well. And so we understood the importance of customer service. And what really shocked me is I switched from being a consultant to working directly for the controller of the National Park Service, and I would be delivering services to the field. And what I mean by that was, rather than being the nudge in whatever HR or finance or budget or contracting that just screams no all day, I would try to understand what the business need was and figure out a way to get to a solution of the business need. That to me is sort of customer service 101, right? Apparently this was unheard of, because I was getting rave reviews from all these people in the field for like attention to customer service that seemed sort of 101 to me. What's the other observation that was not really a great observation when I was back in DC? Wow, some of those people that you think are there to protect you, the Inspector General's office, the General Accounting Office, the oversight committees, they lie. They flat out distort the truth. I saw this firsthand. We had a new law that said essentially government agencies had to develop dual entry accounting systems and produce audited financial statements, right? Sort of people know what audited financial statements are these days. Previous to that, the government didn't really have to do that. We don't report to shareholders, so many of the general ledger stuff that happens isn't really, there is no such thing as this concept of shareholder equity, right? There's a different goal in government. But we didn't keep a general ledger that would support the answers to the question like what's happened to your shareholder equity. And in converting to the new accounting system, we had converted 100 years of different databases all into one new common system, right? And the Inspector General's office, who didn't understand how the new system was, concluded that because there was a 3% difference between the general ledger account, if you follow me, for travel advances, and the list of all the people who had outstanding travel advances, that we didn't know who owed us money. And therefore, we shouldn't get any budget the new year, because our financial statements were, in their words, unauditable. Unauditable. Now, I'm the guy that decided not to write off that 3% difference, which is what, of course, everybody in the real world does when they're converting accounting systems. It's more than 10 years old, right? And it's less than 3%, it's financially immaterial. This list is the thing that's valid. Set your general ledger equal to this list. So I knew that, of course, we weren't unauditable. I spent the next 9 months fighting the Inspector General's office. And after 9 months of 14-hour days, all of a sudden, we had the best track record we could. We were the first agency to have no material findings. Now my question is, if we were that bad, how can you go to that good in 9 months? And the answer is you can't. You should question your auditor. But at the end of the day, I'm here to tell you that I've watched a lot of the stuff that comes from the Inspector General and GAO, and while it's not all bad, there's always an agenda, which is to show you that you need them. In other words, their incentive is to have a finding, and they have to have a finding. What you should do is hold their feet to the fire to give you the real risk assessment associated with that finding. In other words, if they say, we found one case in Denali of somebody using their credit card inappropriately. Oh, that's horrible, right? Well, what's the cost to prevent every? And if you were in the private sector and you had the same set of statistics, or there was a standard, you might report that out to the private sector and they might say, awesome, we're spending too much on our internal controls if we only had one event, right? It's a risk analysis. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into that. But that's another lesson that I learned, is that not all the people that are there to protect you are actually telling you the truth in terms of the real costs and benefits of the alternatives that you as the general public faces. So anyway, we decided to go west, and because I did such a great job, My boss, the controller, even though he couldn't understand why I would want to give up a great career as a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., he finally allowed me to take a downgrade and go be the budget officer at my first park. Guesses? Ah, you already guessed. You read the bio. Nice, right? Yep, good. So Roosevelt's Arch, there we are. We land in Yellowstone. And of course, Yellowstone has all of the stuff that you would expect, right? The geysers and the fumaroles. By the way, this is not like a slideshow of great pictures. This is the pictures that we have. So I apologize for that. They're neat pictures, but the dates aren't necessarily tracking with the dates. This is 1995 now, Andy. We get out to Yellowstone. And they, of course, have the charismatic megafauna, too, right? That's what I learned as the business guy. That's what everybody's into, is tracking the big critters. And bighorn sheep and bison, of course. Wolf reintroduction was while we were there. We helped with the wolf reintroduction. Our first observation, though, on the way there is not only do they have all this neat stuff, but we also, for the first time in our lives, check out this sort of strange, dual-sided nature of people. It's so awe-inspiring that people check their brains out and start doing really, remember the shirt, "I'm with stupid"? They start doing those things when they're in parks, putting their babies on the back of buffalo to get a picture. I mean, what are you doing? This guy, I mean, what? What are you, nuts? We would come around blind curves and see people lying in the road to get a shot up. So sort of an immediate immersion into how powerful these places are to people when they're getting out there for the first time and being immersed, and really the need to sort of channel that wow in a way that's appropriate and keeps them safe too. So first thing I get there, I'm there maybe 2 weeks. And I'm sort of stupid and new to the Park Service, so I just go knock on the superintendent's door, right? I didn't realize he was the king. And it's a Saturday afternoon, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to the local bar. You want to join me?" He said, "Stryker, superintendents don't go to bars." Door shut in my face. Okay, I go to the bar anyway, right? Because I want to meet these people. And that turned into Pool League on Wednesdays. Which turned into going to the high school basketball games in Montana is a really big thing, right? Kind of like you would imagine Hoosiers in Indiana, right? Yeah, let's go 9 hours to see a high school basketball one way, and that'll be our thing for the weekend. But the lesson I learned is how horribly insular and arrogant and obnoxious and not relevant to neighbors park management is in a lot of places. We can talk a good game about wanting to be relevant to diverse populations. We can talk a good game about wanting to be relevant to the millennials. And are we relevant to the millennials the same way we were in the past? But my observation was, if you're not relevant to your neighbors, you got a really big row to hoe. And we saw that via the confrontation and the conflict in every initiative that we tried to undertake, right? Wolf reintroduction, people hated it, people still hate it. Of course, wolves are naturally divisive critters, we can talk about that. But there wasn't a communication vector that would allow us to have an adult conversation. Bison was the same thing. The first year we were there was a die-off of about 1,200. Of course, in Montana ranch thinking, it's because we weren't doing the right livestock management, right? But they trumped up instead this different soundbite, brucellosis. And so out of fear of brucellosis, which is kind of like mad cow disease, the state of Montana decided to start shooting every bison that crossed the boundary line. We won't say anything about the 40,000 head of elk that have brucellosis, because we get to hunt them. We'll only focus on the bison, right? But pick any one of these topics, and the thing that was amazing to me is there was no honest dialogue between upper level management and constituents. And without having that sort of relationship and the ability to be able to look each other in the eye and agree to disagree, we were just always at an impasse. By the time we left there 4 years later, I would go into the bar on a Saturday and it would be, Stryker, you're damn bison. And of course I would be able to say, Franklin, you only have 8 cows. It would be cheaper for me to buy them every year than to have this conversation about brucellosis. Oh yeah, you're right, come on in, I'll buy you a beer, right? So relationships, right? Incredibly important, and in my mind, incredibly low-hanging fruit. So while we're there, I also got to do fun things and learn about the sort of the importance of issues that cross boundaries, like wildland fires, right? So the importance of the Park Service not just adopting its own particular philosophy in an environment where the consequences might go over the boundary lines, right? And if there's an urban interface, that becomes quickly obvious. But this could be disease transmission vectors, it could be wildland fires, et cetera, et cetera. Another sort of formative thing. So here's a good chance to shout out. You guys might want to be up front for this one. Just so hands up so these guys are easier. Because while we're there, we decided to explore the West a little bit. And so we need to see hands because there's signs that you're going to be able to, I know. Well, stick your hand up if you want a prize, and then they'll call you. All right. All right, so those ones both had signs. Ah, Glacier. Nice. Yeah.
No, that's St. Mary's.
In Glacier National Park, though, so we'll give you credit. That's part of my time-lapse photography now, in case anybody wants to shut down a discussion about the science of climate change in Glacier. Is that on the record? Ooh, nice. That was fast. So that wasn't that much of a secret, huh? Okay, how about this one? The very first national monument. Yes, in the system. Good. Good. And while I was there, I also figured out, actually that's just, that's in the Red Desert area of Wyoming. And I just put that slide in because that's where I finally got to do all that neat cowboy stuff, right? And I tried my hands at hunting. I've been hunting ever since. For food, not for trophies. Started with a little antelope, and it's become part of my lifestyle now, the kid that moves west, right? So I started, well, we'll save that for later, but I finally get guns and trucks, and I get to do all this cool stuff that I've been dreaming about for all these years. Okay, so we go a little farther west. This was taken in 1953, which was the sesquicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, celebrating when Lewis and Clark got to the Pacific Ocean in Fort Clatsop. Yep. So we went to Fort Clatsop, and Bobby, that's young Bobby and I, and we did the Lewis and Clark thing.
That must get actually fired.
So what story can I tell you about Lewis and Clark? Really quickly, I'll tell you my goal when I went to Lewis and Clark. 240-acre campus where we think the fort was. And there's all kinds of great stories about finding the fort, and we could go on and on and on if you're, and by the way, I know the answer. On my way in, I asked Professor Gary Moulton, who was transcribing the journals, for his best Lewis and Clark trivia question. Since I was going to be with these true believers every weekend, right, I needed to get some cred. And so he gave me his best Lewis and Clark trivia question, which is the journals record 2 places where Lewis and Clark disagreed with each other. Can you name them? So think about that. So my challenge when I got there was to take this little 240-acre campus, and we had a management plan that called for us to acquire property to put in the trail that they took from the fort to the ocean, to the beach. Problem was, this was dead on arrival because it was going through Willamette, right? Forestry industry. This is sort of shortly after snowy owls, and so the concept of federal overreach and National Park Service, and you want to take jobs away from us. So against this backdrop, the first thing that I notice when I'm here is that Oregon and Washington are at loggerheads, right? We're getting ready to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Lewis and Clark expedition. And here we got Astoria, Oregon in a fight with Oahu across the river over where did Lewis and Clark land? Was it in Oregon or was it in Washington, right? I mean, seriously? So technically they wandered on the north side into the Pacific Ocean, but then they went and they spent the winter, miserable by the way, and they left prematurely, never to return. I'll point that out. They didn't have Gore-Tex either. So they wintered in Oregon. So my point to these folks really early on is, why are you competing with each other, right? If we're talking about capturing the market, the competition is probably St. Louis, right? Or it's Philadelphia. It's not whether it's Oregon or Washington. We're all on the same page. And just to fast forward through a lot of trials and tribulations, in less than 2 years, the proposal to expand the park went from dead on arrival, 240 acres, because of the power of community working together, to an expansion in 2 states now. It ended up being a 2-state solution, 1,500 acres in both states, and it was the first park expansion under the new Republican George Bush Jr., right? Wow, why? Because people got together and said, what's in our common interest? And then they held everybody else accountable, including Willamette, who, by the way, were great partners. They were fabulous partners. And we had some really good politicians guiding me through that early process, too. Senator Wyden in particular just pulled me aside and he said, you know, it's one thing to call me into a meeting, you're the new guy, that's fine, but call me when everybody's on the same page, right? That's what I want to hear. And that was great advice, because his point was, once you're all on the same page, you got the power, right? That's really scary. A lot of politicians won't tell you that, because then you actually are holding them accountable instead of giving them the piece they need, which is, well, people disagree, right? So the more we can sort of sort out those disagreements internally. Anyway, I could spend more time talking about that. Some cool stuff happened there. That's me showing then Secretary, who is that? Is that Norton? Yeah. And Senator Smith around. So the Secretary visited there first in the new administration. That was kind of random and kind of cool. And there's my staff. Don't they look great? And of course, we continue to explore. No. No? Olympic. Right on. I was going to give you a hint. Great beach, great ocean. Yeah. And that's back at Fort Clatsop, actually. But one of the things we funded, as we were exploring, one of the things that I noticed first in Fort Clatsop, and this becomes a theme in the other parks that we visited too, is that almost everywhere we've been, there are better parks outside of the national park, right? And in our case in Fort Clatsop, Fort Stevens was amazing. And it was on the beach and it was cool, and that's where we went to recreate. We also really started to learn for the first time at Fort Clatsop the importance of the indigenous people and the story of the indigenous people. And not to grow a guilt complex, but to understand how much we really have screwed them over in many contexts. And I say that because the descendants of the chief who was there when Fort Clatsop was around showed me a copy of the letter that they nailed to the wall on their way out, leaving the fort to his family. Ding, 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 ding. And at the same time, they were fighting to try to get recognition of their tribe. And again, this became for me a sort of an obvious no-brainer. How can we get our visitors, who of course would love this stuff, to start to understand this in a way that isn't all about guilt? And so we did it with with having descendants actually continue the practice of building canoes, and they did that right there on site, and there was opportunity for good, honest discourse. And anyway, that was sort of a pivotal seed too, I think, in our upbringing in terms of thinking about our relationship and our responsibilities as stewards as we move forward. I'm just watching my time, which is why my cadence is picking up. So next stop, Mount Rushmore, right on. I don't even know who got that right. Biggest issue I had at Mount Rushmore was to have fireworks on July 4th or not to have fireworks on July 4th. And this was incredibly contentious. It was incredibly contentious. By the way, the interesting thing is they had already been doing it for a year or two before I got there. And the interesting thing is, from a marketing perspective, they were genius, right? Because they didn't have fireworks on July 4th, they had fireworks on July 3rd. That way, they were the footage on the morning of the 4th, all through the rest of the country, right? So they sort of grabbed the market first, which was amazing and impressive. But the passions were running so high between this notion of, you're a National Park Service site, right? The Redwoods Amendment in 1978 talked about us all being part of one cohesive set of places, the standards for which apply equally to all of these places. And so how can you possibly have fireworks? And have you thought about the fact that the shrapnel from the fireworks might fall on the squirrel? That squirrel is equally protected and equally important. Well, to fast forward a little bit, after a deep dive into this, my conclusion ended up being fireworks are okay given certain prescriptions, like you're within a fire danger paradigm that makes sense, right? And what compelled me to come to that conclusion? I had a little bit different read of the Redwoods Amendment, but fundamentally, my take-home lesson is, while it's important to think about the contribution of each unit to the service as a whole and to reinforce the Organic Act, the preservation of these places and visitation for your grandchildren's grandchildren, right? It's important to think about that. Really what the Redwoods Amendment was also talking about is the importance of the unique or specific characteristics of each specific park. And in the case of Mount Rushmore, we blew the mountain into the shape of the Great White Fathers. That's a fact. Right? There is no significance to this place without us being there contemplating it. And when you think about America's independence, is there a better place? So as far as I was concerned, as long as you can fit within the fire prescription, which as it turns out, often you can't because it's July in South Dakota and you're out of prescription. So it got too expensive to even think about continuing to do that, to wait until the last minute to just say no. It was just a really expensive notion, and so they have subsequently moved to a laser light show or something. But I will tell you, post 9/11, to be in that place on July 3rd with fireworks in the backward will send shivers down your spine. I think that's the first time, though, that I actually saw in spades something that I've also seen in my further travels, and that's that the Park Service doesn't always necessarily have integrity in our science, okay? And we are supposed to have integrity in science. What do I mean by that? We know the lingo. So when we're responding to these public documents, we can respond as if we're Joe Q Public, and we can use hot button words like impairment. Ooh, impairment, whoa. Redwoods Amendment says we're not supposed to cause an impairment. Well, your opinion of whether something is an impairment, if you're a Park Service employee who's an expert in hydrology and you're postulating on biology, you don't get to be the expert on that so much, right? And sometimes what we're doing is we're sort of influencing, have been in the past guilty of sort of influencing the direction of the decision documents, in my mind, having less than full integrity in science. And that really, really, really bothers me. That's manipulative. That is not okay. By the way, fast forward another 15 years. Now we all have to swear on scientific integrity. It's supposed to be one of our fundamental principles. But again, as the public, you have to always be on the lookout for that person who's, it's okay to have a personal agenda, but it's not okay to use your professional role to drive your personal agenda. You have to be making that separation. I hope that you're always challenging us. Point raised if anybody ever tracked that issue too, where we pretended to make an environmental issue out of something that wasn't an environmental issue. It was a contract issue. We didn't even need the environmental issue. So that was a real major lesson learned there. And again, that's a place where I just saw for the first time how hidebound people can get into polar opposites on sides of an issue, right? Any relevance here, right? How people are sort of, there's no moderation. And what people want to do is they always want to say, well, if you give just an inch here, that's going to set a precedent. And it's the precedent that we can't have. And we can have paralysis by overthinking precedent. And will have paralysis if we overthink precedent. Not everything is necessarily going to be precedent setting if we change our mindset instead to understand that each place is different and unique, and you got to get the specifics of the specific place and time that you're talking about, whatever the specific issue is. So, oh, this is kind of a cool story. Ask me later. There's a Hall of Records back behind whose head? Behind Lincoln's head. The artist had a different idea about what he wanted to do for a little while. Instead of finishing the other presidents, he was going to put in this Hall of Records, which is really cool, and it was going to tell the story in case UFOs came in 40,000 years and didn't understand what this was. It would tell the history and it would tell the story of it, and they started building the hallway to what would have been the top of the dome, and it's really up there. It's super cool, but by then we caught him and said, focus over here. We're trying to get these other 3 presidents finished instead of building this hall. So there's nothing in there, but it's a great example of the process that you would use, right? So you can see the original drill marks because they would drill first in a honeycomb, and then they would set the explosives and it would take the sheet off. So it's a really cool place, but mere mortals aren't allowed up there, of course, post 9/11. The security paranoia associated with Mount Rushmore was quite high and kind of got shut down. Again, another place where we really learned the power of the other places that weren't national park sites, right? And the power of appreciation of the indigenous peoples. So if people recognize Crazy Horse, that is not federal. They've never accepted $1 from the feds, never will. The original artist's inception was if the people want this, then they will finance it. Fabulous place, fabulous stories with those folks. We know them. If you ever get down there, call me, we'll put you in touch. But again, there's sometimes better places outside of the National Park Service site. Okay, next we go to what I call, our parents are aging, right? We want to go back east for a tenure. And so we decided to go to what I like to phrase the best of the West in the East. Southern West Virginia. Yeah, you got it. I mean, so this is the new River Gorge. Nobody's ever heard of this, notwithstanding your introduction. The new Blue and the Gauley. What is this, though? This is big water, right? And in the case of the Gauley River, they have, well, first of all, it's dam fed, and they do a release to draw down the reservoir in the winter. So after all the western rivers are running dry, the Gauley is just ramping up there in September for 4 weeks, and they have 125 class 3+ rapids in 25 miles. So it is literally hit it, read it, run it, read it, run it, and it is nonstop. And by the way, if you see it when it's low, it's all undercut rock. There's, I think, 5 class 5s there. And I don't know if you know water classification, but class 6, the insurance companies wouldn't classify. So class 5 is as high as it goes. They're probably class 6s, which has to do with how technical are they and what's your death potential if you screw it up. Big water. Yeah, well, they claim it's commercially unrunnable. Yep. Bobby was a guide. You'll see in a minute.
64 rapids and 8 miles on the upper part.
On the upper part. Craziness. It's also big for rock climbing. There's big water. There's little Bobby when he was, I think, 14, guiding people through one of these class 4 plus. Yeah, maybe that day. We also had amazing cultural resources here, right? I want to point that out. This is the Nuttallburg mine, right? So when you think about Ford, especially in business school, right? Ford wanted vertical integration, right? He wanted everything, not just make the cars, but I need to have the rubber and I need to have the coal to heat the steel or the rubber. So he bought a mine, and that was this mine site here in Nuttallburg. This tipple is amazingly famous, reconstructed. This is unbelievable history, right? This is one of the important things that I learned at Fort Clatsop that was reinforced here too. A lot of times in the Park Service, we like to talk about, is it cultural resources or is it natural resources or is it recreation resources? Which is the one that's really sort of supposed to dominate, right? And what I have observed, tell me if this resonates with you, that it's not an either or. What really grabbed people is the notion of people in place, right? So it was like the Lewis and Clark and the expedition suffering there day after day, more rain, more rain, more rain, right? It's people, that's the compelling story. That's the piece that people wanted to hear about. By the same token, people wanted to hear about what was the miner's life at the turn of the century in these coal mines. What is the history? There's some neat history associated with that tipple and that conveyor belt. But it's not mutually exclusive. And I see that even here at Denali, right? You think big wilderness, right? There's no people connection. But every tour that I've given, people are riveted when they get to Cantition and they hear about Judge Wickersham and they hear about the gold rush and they want to know about the people and they hear about Fannie Quigley, right? That's what is like, wow, okay? It's that nexus between people and place. Excuse me. So, guess who that is? It's not a prize question. Bobby. They also do a lot of rappelling there. My final story for this stop is, this is the place where I really learned that economic development and conservation are not mutually exclusive. So the Park Service had the control points to the 876-foot high New River Gorge Bridge, right? If anybody's ever seen that, Bobby, you want to shout out a few facts about the bridge?
So before the bridge was built, they used to have to take a one-way all the way down to the river and all the way back up, which took about 2 hours to go down and then back up. It used to be a two-way, now it's a one-way that buses fly around there. Then they built a bridge, which is about 3/4 of a mile long, and now it takes about, 10 seconds to drive from one end to the other. After they built the bridge, it's the largest single arch bridge in the Western Hemisphere, 876 feet from the bottom of the bridge down to the water. Every day, third Saturday in October, they have what's called Bridge Day. After the bridge was built, they started letting base jumpers jump off of it one day a year. They closed down the whole bridge. People jump off of it. They're crazy. People rappel it. We've all done it. We did the rappel.
So while we're there, to get me over my fear of heights, my passionate partner in crime decides that he'll put us on rope, and after 5 warm-up lessons rappelling, I rappel off the bridge.
It's about 850 feet for the rappel.
You have to have a long rack to control the weight of the rope. It's so long. These people are crazy. They're nuts. So I didn't lose my fear of heights. So the next year he had me climb the rope to kick off Bridge Day with a Park Service flag. And I kind of got over it that day because I was so angry. What he didn't tell me is that rope walking, it's not as hard as it seems with the system we used, but it's a bunch of 6-inch steps. That was like running a 10K in 6-inch steps to get that. So I was mad by the time I got to the top of the bridge. I was over my fear of heights. I was, where's Benji? But anyway, we had this great economic development opportunity. There's an inspection catwalk under the bridge, but the state owns the bridge and we own the access points, and never the two shall meet. After a lot of sort of banging heads together, the governor and I finally put together a package that would allow for this bridge walk. And we did a sort of a joint economic development opportunity. And now you can go out and you can clip in safely to a cable and walk this inspection catwalk and experience the New River Gorge and the bridge and the railroad history and the coal mine history all during a recreation or a recreation adventure, right? That got the governor thinking, wow, this is awesome. The Boy Scouts are hosting a national competition for a new permanent home for their jamboree, which was previously on a military base. The military sort of wanted it back. It's every 4 years, but post 9/11 it ended up being a big deal to the military. So they had a national competition for who was going to win this site, and it was also going to be what ended up being a $500 million development for a new adventure base. Long story short, we made a pitch, we won, and so the new jamboree, the Bechtel site, the summit we call it, is co-located with New River Gorge. So you can do the benefits of sort of that 70,000 acres. I can't underscore how important this was. When we got to West Virginia, I got to say we were shocked. If you remember the commercials with the Crying Indian, I'll call him, you know, it was sort of give a hoot, don't pollute, but that was the one that was really powerful to me. If you remember some of the other scenery in that, that was West Virginia when we got there. My God, people were throwing their McDonald's bags out their car windows while they're driving down the road. In New River Gorge, what is this? This is criminal, I don't understand it. And everything was dilapidated and falling apart, sort of no concept of recycling. I came to understand that there's a whole social paradigm there that comes out of the mine culture, right? The mines owned everything. And so what you would see as you went around that area, when you went inside those shacks that looked so horrible on the outside, they were immaculate inside. And that was a result of the whole culture of having the mine company own all the land. There was no investment, there was no public investment, and nobody cared. Anyway, by the time this economic development project came along, we teamed with the Boy Scouts and we sent out crews of Boy Scouts to assist in communities in areas that people wanted help with, whatever, free labor, sign me up. By the time I left New River Gorge, 8 counties had completely turned themselves around. I understand today it's gone statewide. So the power of what started as an economic development project to start shifting thinking into what ultimately becomes a conservation and a beautification thing is, well, you can't understate it. Super lesson there. Cool stuff. Restored that tipple, right? That was a trivia question. That's a Roebling Bridge. New River had a Roebling Bridge. The other Roebling Bridge is, it's basically the wires. So famous one in New York. Brooklyn Bridge. Cool stuff, more neat pictures, okay? So finally, and 9 minutes over, I got here. And we have charismatic megafauna. And we have really cool cultural stuff. So has anybody been to the Quigley cabin? So that's Gretchen standing. Gretchen's not that tall. Fanny Quigley was kind of short. She had custom cabinets, right? That's a pretty neat story. And we have great stories like that here in Denali. And once again, I'll say for me, if you don't know these two women, you should meet them someday. When I got here, I had to take my course in Anilka, and these two lovely young women were the long-term, like since Anilka, teaching Anilka from the state's perspective. And so in my early days here, there's a little bit of a, so of course the first thing that I do is have a cookout and give them a couple beers and then get pictures of them in ranger hats, right? Which if I ever need to use them, is to hold them hostage for any reason. But again, sort of the themes that you've seen from other places in other parks are certainly present here in Denali. You know, when I look at sort of the list of big challenges that we have in Denali, whether it's, you know, I would think challenge number one would have to be the relationship that I have with the state, or the lack of a relationship that I have with the state. I really need to figure out how to change the dialogue so that we can have honest conversations and not everything is reduced to federal overreach.
Who are you exactly referring to as the state?
I mean, I don't have a relationship with the governor and his cabinet. In the other places I've been, the governor had my phone number and would take great pride in saying, I know where you live. I just tracked you down. But the quid pro quo for that was I had access to his cabinet. So when it was people being knuckleheads on either side of the equation, we could get it sorted out quick on behalf of all of the people who really have common perspective, right? And I think this is going to be a direction that we need to come to on things like wolves. Wolves, we are not going to lead with Don Stryker standing out front representing the Park Service for what we're doing with wolves on state land. We're not going to win. Wolves has to be you deciding that a non-consumptive use of wolves is something that you value, we value as Alaskans, not me being included as a Park Service guy. That's the way we're going to win that. That's when we're going to come to consensus and concur and then, right, flip the equation and then have the politicians where we want them. So I say that the state, the governor's office, the federal delegation, it's taken me 4 years here to get any kind of access. I finally got Don Young to punch me in the arm and say, you're okay, let me know if you need help with any of those assholes in Anchorage, right? But it's a question of building that rapport and building those relationships, and you just sort of got to do it one at a time. You know, I think we're going to have an honest conversation eventually about access to Denali. My latest data is showing me that we may be less than 10 years from catastrophic failure on the road. This is not surprising to anybody who's been around, but we're not having that conversation yet. You know what? I don't want to be the guy that kills people. And what's going to come with that conversation is an honest conversation about what does access in the future look like, and does it need to be the same thing that it's been in the past? Or zip line, I love it. Anyway, so we have all these challenges here. I'm going to leave it on that in terms of closing up the formal part of this so that we can get into Q&A. I'd ask for a round of applause for my assistants before we do that. And now let's just go straight to Q&A. Anybody's got questions?
Two quick questions.
Yes, sir.
Igloo Creek Campground is different. Can't make reservations there. And in some ways that's good and bad. Is that going to be the way things are in the future? And I say that as a biker, a pedal biker, who uses that as a stepping stone. And in last year and this year, centennial years, it's been real hard to get there.
Okay, so what do you think we should do?
I have no idea. I think there ought to be a campground somewhere between Igloo and Webber Lake
Other people?
for campers.
We're getting too many camps in there now, that's why you got so much traffic. You kept them on outside and they went to their cabins instead of driving in there. You'd be a lot better off. And if you cut the buses back, like I fought it 8 years ago, y'all told me there's no problem with the buses. We fought it for 3 years, and then y'all wrote out the big deal. Oh, we gotta cut back on the buses, we need to go see the government and everything.
Okay, so
You can figure that out on buses, when you got 3 buses lined up on them curves and everything, it's gonna break that curve down.
Yep.
With the cliff part of it. And
Yep.
now y'all just dawned 8 years later that it's gonna happen. I mean, when you
Lots of
hold
good
down
thoughts
below
here,
them and
so-
look up and see them breaking on the outside.
let me
you
start
probably better
with
do
Igloo
something.
specifically. I didn't know we were taking reservations. I'll look into it. One of the things that I focused on really, really early here, though, was relevancy to our neighbors. And when you mention you're a biker, what I've heard from our neighbors in terms of what do they want to see in the park is, I mean, candidly, what we lived when we were in Yellowstone, right? During the 100 Days of Chaos, we don't want to be in Denali. we want to be anywhere but Denali during that 10 Days of Chaos. But what about opportunities for biking when the road is plowed and before the road is open? That's something that we've really started experimenting with. So we're doing early plowing, and then we do a rolling opening now. We're not really advertising it per se because we don't have the infrastructure in terms of food and lodging and other things to catch up with it. But we're seeing a huge increase in the shoulder seasons. And we are definitely thinking about when I say other means of access, the fact that the road access by bus probably isn't going to be able to satisfy the future. So what are some other ways to experience the park? Do we need more access points? And do we need opportunities like you talk about, where you could bike instead of taking the bus? And in order to satisfy that, that matches well with a winter phenomena, which is on the increase, which is to take dog sleds, not for the dog sled ride, but you use the dog sleds to haul your gear, and then you go from place to place on your skis, right? So very wilderness experience, very historically relevant, very accurate. And what we didn't have is we didn't have the infrastructure yet, so we're building some of these little Quonset huts that you might have seen that are going to support that. I'm hoping those structures will also, when appropriate and when not conflicting, be able to satisfy some of these other uses that you're talking about.
I think actually the information for biking on the website is excellent.
Okay, good. And you're not getting dusted by too many buses?
The buses are great. They go to walking speed,
Okay.
to wave at someone.
How do people feel? Too many buses now? About the right amount?
Who knows?
Who knows? I mean, this is something else we learned. How many bison should there be in Yellowstone? I have a really strong opinion. As many as when I first got there. Right?
Wolves here ought to be there for that.
Yeah.
You're trying to manage them on the outside of the park on private property.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was question one, you said two?
Oh, so last summer, very crowded at the park because of the 2 centennials. Are you expecting visitation might be a little bit less crazy next summer?
I'm not.
No?
No, I'm not. And I can't tell you this scientifically, but anecdotally, I'm seeing an uptick in not tours, right? Not the commercial boats. We're seeing more independent people, more independent travelers coming, and I think it's just a combination of gas is low. It's scary to travel other places, and Alaska's sort of on people's bucket list, and I think a younger group of older people are starting to come, and they're much more independent, and they want to do things. I think when I talk about alternative uses, if you could have some hiking trails, and that would satisfy people, and particularly if we could look at other access points that are easy to put in hiking trails that would be hardened so you're not going to have a lot of erosion, but then you can get a view of the mountain. That might be perfectly appropriate for a whole range of visitors who then don't need to get on a school bus and drive for 8 hours, and I mean, that's not I don't like it. Anyway, yes ma'am.
I'm a visitor, I'm from Michigan. And one thing we did notice about the park is that you don't have to pay to get in. I mean, you can just drive in, you know?
You're supposed to have a car.
So there's sort of a little secret.
But no, I mean, I know that we paid because we stopped and we camped and everything. But you can just drive in. In most places, you have to go through a gate, pay your price, and go in.
So we have an entry fee. 80% of the guests that come to Denali actually come up on the cruise lines, and so they're coming in on a bus, and it's cheaper for us rather than having a gate to control that through the cruise ship industry. And even though we're on record, I'll say I'm not jumping up and down to go out and get $10 from every one of my neighbors that's coming in. Right? That about covers us. Senator Murkowski is not a big fan of fees. She figures that we've paid for it in our taxes. And so from my perspective, what I would like to do on the notion of fees, though, is to come up, sir, as you're saying, one of the things I've learned is that good policy incentivizes the right behavior, right? So if you set the rules the right way, then people are naturally going to do what they should be doing. And what do I mean by that? Rather than telling people, no, you can't take any firewood for our subsistence users at all, or you can only take 2 cords, and it has to meet these criteria in terms of diameter of trees and blah, 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 blah. Instead, we could say, so the rules are, we want you to follow best practice. Here are the standards that we want to have. We need to have a density of this many live, dead trees to be what do you call them? Nurture comes to mind. But basically, that's what all the critters need, right? Is they need some standing dead trees. And if you can express the rules in terms of standards, or there's a real desire for our subsistence community in 3,000 acres only, where they have historically used all kinds of different vehicles, going back to bulldozers, to retrieve moose, our subsistence users would like to use an OHV, an off-road vehicle, to retrieve the moose. And so far, the debate has been yes, no, we're at extremes. We're talking about something that's going to be precedent setting for the rest of the universe. If you think about that from the perspective of good policy incentivizing the right behavior, if instead our rules could be, this is the standard that's acceptable. We can have damage up to a level that there is, within a 1 mile view, 2 tracks visible that won't heal themselves within 10 miles. I completely made that up. But you see how I stated what's a standard. And our standard might change over time, but if what we set instead of a rule is a standard, then those folks recognize, oh, I can do this, but I can't get carried away with myself, because as soon as we're out of standard, and then they start, what? Policing for us. So the other thing I would like to do in terms of fees is set a fee policy that incentivizes the right behavior. And as you, sir, were hitting the nail on the head, it should be way more expensive for heavy vehicles. The over-the-road standard is somewhere along the lines of a single passenger car does the same amount of damage in terms of the expense to your road, or you can have 100,000 single passenger cars for one 18-wheeler truck. And if the toll that we charge to use the road, for whoever the user is going to be, was appropriate to actually pay for the maintenance costs, all of a sudden you wouldn't see people running big heavy buses just because they can, right? They'd have a financial incentive to make sure they're doing the right thing. So I'd like to see our fee structure change to something that's more appropriate for a place like Denali, where we don't have a gate with lines of people with private vehicles. It's a restricted road. So that model doesn't really make a lot of sense. I have to fight Washington to do that, though, so stay tuned. Yes, sir.
I worked myself through 2 degrees of college as a trail crew foreman in Olympic National Park.
Right on.
It was great, but I had, my crews were dingling sons of governors and publishers and so forth. And I am wondering if you face that at Denali.
I don't have any dinglings. No, you know, I don't think there's the same pressure that there was years ago to give people jobs sort of from nepotism. Or perhaps they've gotten more sophisticated because now the people that are getting those jobs are presidential appointees and they're our bosses. So connect the dots. Other questions? No Lone Ranger trivia? No? You don't want to know where Tonto came from, for real?
One question.
One question? Where? Oh, Dan. Of course you can. Have you been sitting on your hands?
I'm a great advocate of South Denali concept. And given the fact that you can, as an ecologist, you want to put 3 pounds of, you can't put 3 pounds of tundra detritus in a 2-pound can. What's the relationship to establish with the cruise companies so that there are people that want a wildlife experience in Denali aren't going to have one in South Denali concept, and there isn't room to put more people in the park if that's the premise?
So the question, what's the relationship with sort of the state on this concept of a South Denali State Park?
Well, the question is the relationship between the marketing folks and the cruise industry.
So the relationship there is perfect. The cruise ship industry is dying to get a South Denali State Park in. In fact, they invested $1 million to bring the Phase 3 electricity in. For folks, do folks sort of generally know the South Denali concept? What is it? No, so the old South Denali concept was Petersville Road. They did a new NEPA environmental assessment and came up with right around mile 203. Boy, so it's in Denali State Park. It's right after the south viewpoint. Yeah, I'm sorry. And the state has put a road in so far. They paid to put a road in. This is one of the very few really good cooperative opportunities that I think the National Park Service has to work with the state and with state parks. Because you're exactly right. Other places to take the pressure off. Not everything has to be in the park, right? That was one of the themes. And in some cases, if you can develop these other places, the average person isn't going to know whether they're in Denali State Park or Denali National Park or care, right? The people that have their passports to get stamped, right? You're going to know. The true believers are still going to come, but the masses of them would be fine with going to another place that you can have a great experience and a view of Denali. And in fact, the state could do things that aren't appropriate on the federal property. So my very real goal is to advance this notion of a Denali State and National Park. And in 40 years, that's the way people think about things. It's Denali State and National Park. And I think that would be the epicenter of the local recreational community would be down there. Everybody who's got their friends coming in to Anchorage would be going down to that part. I'll throw out one other little sort of thinking about the power of partnerships, random, what do you think about this aha moment that I had not long ago? Huge increase in winter visitation, right? Everybody wants to come down to see the mountain. You guys have probably seen, there's probably a 747 a week, at least the Chinese market is telling us there's a 747 a week that they will bond, they will guarantee a 747 a week if we build out the infrastructure. So last winter alone, 100 buses they ran up the Hall Road, right? So I talked to the guy from Premier and he said, I don't want to drive up the Hall Road anymore. And I said, well, wow, they should make one of those TV series off of you, right? Instead of Ice Road Truckers, Ice Road Bus Tours. It seemed like a crazy notion anyway. But they're talking about, so what is there in Denali? Can we come down and see the mountain? And of course, we're plowing out to the first 10 miles, right? And folks who have been there, that's awesome for us. You can see the mountain from there, but let's face it. It's winter. Everything's got snow on it. It's the one that's a little bit, from this perspective, a little bit higher. What if there was a facility that folks could drive to out in Broad Pass? Okay? And this is what really got me thinking. Wouldn't it be awesome to tell an authentic Native Alaskan story somewhere? And that's all Ahtna land in that stretch. So if we could all get our collective resources and energy together to figure out a real, authentically done on behalf of all of the tribes on Ahtna land, some kind of cultural center, the market is there for it. And it's just a question of us sort of getting together. So South Denali, yes, but man, this other idea about Broad Pass, because we're never going to be, well, we're not in the next 100 years probably going to be a Yellowstone type winter tourism market where people act. Nobody wants to be here in December and January. And we don't want to work in December and January, do we? I mean, honestly. But we are going to see that growth sort of on the shoulders to where it ends up being a bunch of time on long weekends. And we're going to need to grow out that winter piece, which if we do it wisely, will complement well, taking the pressure off the demand in the 110 days of chaos too. But it's going to take all of us sort of coming together and saying to ourselves, there are areas we're going to agree to disagree, and let's just not talk about it. Let's talk about the stuff that is good economic development opportunities. Let's talk kids and jobs. Let's talk about overlap of our objectives in terms of kids and jobs, right? And if we think about that, the conservation piece is going to take care of itself. It's a really good question. Thanks for the setup.
What all the cruise companies have to do is segment the people that are happy to see the mountain and not a grizzly bear.
Yes. Yes. I'll tell you what, though. I mean, by show of hands, for the Alaskans here, if you had to choose between the summer grizzly bear or the March view of the mountain, how many people would do summer grizzly bear? Okay, so it's about, how many people would do March view of the mountain? Okay, so I'd say roughly that's like 1/3, 2/3. So the market might divide itself nicely, certainly. Yes, sir.
You said your fun trivia fact was about Lewis and Clark disagreeing on two things you never revealed what those were.
So any guesses?
Should have been Clark and Lewis?
What?
Should have been Clark and Lewis?
Should it be clear? Yeah. No, actually they convinced the Corps of Discovery that they were both captains the whole time. I'm not sure historically that they ever did that, but there's a little bit of a management insight there too. No, they disagreed about salt and dog. And I can't remember which one of them, but one of them didn't care for the taste of both, and the other one liked both. And I don't think it was the guy with the dog that didn't like the taste of dog. So it must have been Clark that didn't like dog or didn't really prefer salt. That's an award-winning trivia question, by the way. That stumped everybody 100% of the time. So.